In the centuries when Egypt still believed itself untouchable, when the Nile's yearly flood seemed like a contract with the gods ensuring stability forever, no one imagined that danger could roll toward them on wheels. The scribes in their courts, the generals in their garrisons, the peasants in their fields, none had any reason to fear the scattered desert tribes beyond the Sinai. Those people wandered with flocks and traded for grain. They posed no threat to the mighty two lands. Yet in those wide-open deserts, in lands Egypt dismissed as barren and backward, an innovation was taking shape that would one day tear open the illusion of Egyptian invincibility. The horse, still rare in Egypt, had become central to warfare in the Levant. Lightweight wooden frames, two wheels reinforced with rawhide, and teams of fast-moving mares allowed skilled warriors to travel at terrifying speed. These chariots became symbols of prestige for chieftains whose names meant nothing to Egypt until the day those wheels crossed the border. It began quietly. Foreign families entered the Delta looking for work or trade, settling in villages alongside Egyptians. At first, they were welcomed, for Egypt was wealthy and saw itself as generous. But these newcomers brought a restlessness with them, a way of moving through the world that Egyptians found strange. They hunted differently, fought differently, spoke with sharp accents, and carried weapons unfamiliar to Egyptian eyes. Among them were clans who had perfected the art of mounted archery long before Egypt even considered horses a tool of war. Over years, those migrants grew in number, forming tight-knit enclaves. Egyptian officials tolerated them, believing the powerful traditions of Kemet would absorb any outsider. No one realized they were allowing the seeds of conquest to take root. Political fractures widened across Egypt. The last kings of the Middle Kingdom struggled to control distant provinces, and local governors grew bold, taxing their own people like miniature kings. As the country weakened, the foreigners living in the Delta watched closely. They took note of disorganized garrisons, crumbling forts, and infighting among Egyptian elites. When their scouts reported that troops in the eastern Delta often patrolled slowly on foot, unaware of the speed and deadliness chariots could deliver, the leaders of the migrant clans saw an opportunity none had dreamed possible. It started with a single devastating clash. An Egyptian infantry patrol marched eastward, expecting a minor skirmish with raiders. Instead, they were engulfed by a dust cloud that moved with unnatural speed. Before they could form defensive ranks, a ring of screaming horses and spinning wheels encircled them. Arrows flew so rapidly the soldiers barely raised their shields before the first ranks collapsed. The battle lasted minutes. Survivors returned south, babbling about enemies who moved faster than thought, who fired arrows while racing in circles, who vanished before the Egyptians even understood what had happened. Many generals dismissed these reports as exaggerated tales told by frightened recruits, but more encounters followed, each ending in disaster. The foreigners were no longer scattered nomads, they were an organized force. And they were testing Egypt. Their chieftain, Salidas, a man whose cunning was whispered about even among his allies, began forging a coalition of tribes into a single military body. He understood that traditional infantry, even disciplined Egyptian infantry, could not stand against chariot warfare. So he planned, waited, and struck when Egypt's political center finally faltered. The assault on the Delta was not a reckless raid. It was coordinated, swift, and surgical. Chariots swept into key towns guarding the water channels like thunder rolling over calm fields. Egyptian defenders, unused to moving quickly, found themselves overrun before they could even send word south. Chariot wheels cut deep ruts through the mud streets of fortified towns that had not seen real battle in generations. Panic spread. Entire villages fled without a fight at the mere sound of approaching hoofbeats. Memphis fell without a true siege, its walls designed to resist slow-moving soldiers, not darting chariots. With that victory, the foreigners whom Egyptians would later call the Hyksos, the rulers of foreign lands, claimed the Delta as their own. What astonished Egyptians most was not just the military takeover, but the way the Hyksos ruled. They adopted Egyptian titles, honored Egyptian gods, and used Egyptian scribes to manage the land. They were conquerors, yet they styled themselves as pharaohs, blending their culture with the one they had subdued. Many Egyptians, frightened and confused, accepted this new order. Others seethed quietly, especially in the south, where Thebes remained untouched. There, the old royal line still held power, diminished but proud. The Theban princes paid tribute to the Hyksos, but their hearts burned with humiliation. In quiet rooms lit by oil lamps, they plotted rebellion. Sekenenre-Tau, a Theban ruler remembered for his bravery, challenged Hyksos authority first. His defiance triggered brutal retaliation. He died violently, his skull smashed in battle, his wounds so deep that later archaeologists still shuddered at the sight. His son Kamose picked up the cause, launching daring raids northward, burning Hyksos outposts and capturing enemy messengers. He declared publicly that Egypt must not remain divided, that foreign kings had no right to sit on Egyptian thrones. His campaign rekindled hope but ended abruptly when he too died before achieving victory. The final chapter of liberation belonged to Ahmose, Kamose's younger brother. Unlike his predecessors, Ahmose understood that to defeat the Hyksos, Egypt needed more than anger and tradition. It needed innovation. The Thebans studied captured chariots piece by piece. Craftsmen stripped them down, weighed each component, tested leathers, measured wheel spokes, and rebuilt them with Egyptian improvements. Bowmakers designed stronger composite bows capable of firing farther and more accurately. For the first time, Egyptian soldiers trained not in slow formations, but in mounted mobility, archery from motion, and coordinated charges. When Ahmose launched his war, he did so with a transformed army capable of meeting the Hyksos on equal terms. The battles that followed became legend. In the marshlands of the Delta, where chariots moved swiftly along firm ground, Egyptian and Hyksos forces collided with earth-shaking intensity. Arrows darkened the sky, wheels shattered against shields, and warriors on both sides fought with the desperation of those who knew that the fate of nations depended on their skill. Ahmose's strategy was relentless. He cut off Hyksos' supply lines, seized control of canals, isolated fortresses, and weakened the enemy slowly. The siege of Avaris, the Hyksos capital, became the ultimate test. The city was fortified, its walls thick, its storehouses filled. But month by month, Ahmose tightened his grip. Famine crept into the city. Disease followed. The once invincible Hyksos chariot lords felt their power slip away. In the final assault, Egyptian forces stormed Avaris with the fury of generations of pent-up rage. Chariots smashed through the gates, infantry poured over the breaches, and the elite Hyksos warriors realized that the civilization they had conquered had now mastered the very weapon that once made them unstoppable. The city fell. Survivors fled north into Canaan, chased by Ahmose's forces to ensure they would never return. Egypt was whole again, and its people hailed Ahmose as the founder of a new era, the New Kingdom, an age of expansion, wealth, and power, made possible in part by the lessons learned from their conquerors. Though they were expelled, the Hyksos changed Egypt forever. The Egyptians embraced the chariot, integrating it into their armies and elevating the pharaoh into a warrior king whose power was displayed through mastery of horses and wheels. From that point onward, the sound of chariot wheels would echo across the deserts, carrying Egypt into battles far beyond its borders and shaping the identity of its greatest rulers. For in its darkest moment, Egypt had faced an unfamiliar enemy wielding unfamiliar weapons. And in overcoming that challenge, the civilization reinvented itself. The Hyksos invasion was not merely a chapter of conquest, it was the turning point that transformed a kingdom rooted in tradition into an empire, forged by innovation and resilience. As the Hyksos tightened their control over the delta, their presence seeped into every layer of Egyptian life, not only through force but through the subtle reshaping of daily existence. Markets once filled with the gentle rhythm of Egyptian trade now echoed with foreign accents, unfamiliar goods, and the clatter of chariot wheels rolling through streets that had never known such sounds. In the palaces of Avaris, Hyksos nobles, dressed in linen robes embroidered with Eastern patterns, ate from Egyptian-style plates and issued commands in the royal halls where pharaohs once proclaimed the eternal strength of the two lands. Many Egyptians adapted quickly, welcoming new opportunities, forming partnerships, or simply surviving under the new rulers who imposed taxes but allowed agriculture and trade to flourish. Yet beneath this thin surface of stability, resentment simmered like an unacknowledged storm. Priests muttered prayers for liberation. Scribes preserved records that secretly portrayed the Hyksos as usurpers, and countless families whispered stories of the glorious past when Egyptian kings ruled without challenge. The Hyksos, confident in their power, seemed unaware that the very culture they were absorbing had begun to resist them in ways their chariots could not strike down. Meanwhile, in Thebes, the southern stronghold that refused to kneel completely, a quiet revolution was beginning to take shape. The ruling family of Thebes, descended from the proud line of Middle Kingdom pharaohs, understood that open rebellion would be suicidal without a transformation of their forces. Walking armies could not defeat an enemy who could strike and vanish before infantry even raised their shields. Thus, Theban workshops became laboratories of experimentation, where craftsmen studied captured chariot parts and attempted to replicate foreign manufacturing techniques. Woodworkers reshaped frames to lighten them. Leatherworkers crafted harnesses designed to distribute weight across horse shoulders, and blacksmiths forged bronze fittings with newfound precision. Horses, once rare in Egypt, multiplied in stables near the river's edge. Warriors who had spent their lives marching in tight ranks now learned to balance on speeding platforms, to fire arrows while feeling the wind tear across their faces. Slowly, painfully, Egypt was learning the art of speed. Generations of caution gave way to a new spirit of aggression, one shaped not by tradition but by necessity. Ahmose, youngest brother of Kamose and the last surviving prince of his line, grew up in this atmosphere of urgency. From childhood, he understood that Egypt's survival depended on mastering the weapons of its conquerors. He watched scarred veterans of Hyksos skirmishes teach Theban youths how to shoot from a chariot, how to anticipate the sweeping arc of a turning wheel, how to trust the surge of a horse beneath them. These lessons, shouted beneath the burning sun and practiced across fields churned with dust, forged a generation unlike any before it. By the time Ahmose came of age, his city had transformed into a crucible of resistance. Each failed Hyksos attempt to intimidate Thebes only fueled its determination. Merchants funneled wealth to the palace, farmers pledged grain for soldiers, and priests called upon the ancient gods to remember their promise to protect the rightful heirs of Egypt. When Ahmose ascended to the throne after Kamose's death, the people looked to him not as a ruler of a weakened region, but as the embodiment of their collective rage and hope. His first act was not to negotiate, nor to retreat into safety, but to expand the army in a bold declaration of defiance. Chariots rolled onto training grounds by the dozens, horses galloped at the crack of whips, and commanders drilled their forces until exhaustion blurred their vision and pride stiffened their resolve. Ahmose knew that to fight the Hyksos, he needed more than courage. He needed a war machine that could match theirs. Scouts infiltrated the delta, gathering intelligence on Hyksos supply routes, fortifications, and chariot deployments. They reported that while the Hyksos remained formidable, their rule was not as solid as it appeared. Political rivalries among chariot lords had created fractured alliances, and many Egyptian-born subjects in the delta resented their foreign masters. Moreover, the Hyksos had grown accustomed to domination and had grown sloppy, assuming their superiority would last forever. Ahmose recognized the opportunity and prepared to strike. His campaign began with small, precise attacks, not frontal assaults. He targeted Hyksos outposts along the desert edge, cutting off communications and forcing the foreign rulers to respond. The speed and accuracy of these raids shocked the Hyksos, who were unprepared for Egyptian forces capable of moving as quickly as they did. As Ahmose's reputation spread, Theban soldiers found themselves welcomed as liberators by many Delta communities who had long suffered under heavy Hyksos taxation. The young pharaoh personally led charges, standing atop his chariot with a calm intensity that inspired absolute loyalty from his troops. Each victory fed the next. Each fallen outpost weakened the Hyksos grip. As Thebes advanced northward, Hyksos leaders scrambled to coordinate their defenses. They assembled chariot squadrons, reinforced walls, and summoned their most experienced commanders. But Ahmose anticipated their moves with uncanny precision, often striking where they least expected. He understood that the war would not be won through brute force alone. It required strategy, patience, and the ability to redefine Egyptian warfare at its core. When Ahmose's forces finally reached Avaris, the Hyksos capital, the city loomed like a fortress of foreign ambition. Its walls soared high, its markets bustled with mixed cultures, and its harbor swarmed with ships carrying goods from across the Mediterranean. Yet beneath its vibrant surface, the city trembled with unrest. Many of its residents, Egyptians living under foreign rule, secretly welcomed Ahmose's approach. The siege of Avaris would be a long and brutal ordeal, a test of endurance that would determine the fate of Egypt itself. And as Ahmose prepared for the final stage of the war, the clash between chariot kingdoms and walking empires was about to reach a scale neither side had ever imagined. Ahmose's victory at Avaris did not end the echoes of the Hyksos threat. It merely opened the next chapter in a struggle that would define Egypt's identity for generations. Because beyond the smoking ruins of the Delta stronghold, the remnants of the Hyksos elite raced eastward in their once unstoppable chariots, clinging to the hope that the open lands of Canaan would give them room to regroup, rebuild, and reclaim what had been lost. Ahmose understood that allowing them to escape intact would be a mistake Egypt could not afford. The Hyksos had carved humiliation into Egypt's bones, had forced princes to kneel, had turned pharaohs into tax-paying vassals. And the people would never feel secure while the invaders still drew breath just beyond the frontier. And so, without rest, he pushed his newly disciplined army across Sinai. His own chariot divisions, now full of confidence and hardened by the brutal sieges of the Delta. What followed was a pursuit as relentless as the desert sun. Hyksos chariots, once feared for their unmatched maneuverability, found themselves hunted by an enemy that had mastered their own art. Egyptian charioteers no longer rode as curious imitators. They rode with fury and precision, their composite bows bending into crescents of power as they fired volleys at wheels, horses, and the armored backs of their fleeing foes. Each skirmish chipped away at Hyksos' morale. Their supply lines collapsed, their alliances fractured. Chiefs who once stood shoulder to shoulder now snapped at each other, each blaming the others for the catastrophe at Avaris. As the chase drove them deeper into Canaan, the Hyksos discovered a cruel irony. The same deserts they had once crossed as confident conquerors had become tombs in waiting. Horses faltered, wheels splintered, food dwindled, and through it all, Ahmose pressed forward, refusing to let time soften the message he intended to carve into the annals of history. At the fortress of Sharuhen, the last Hyksos refuge, the invaders made their final stand. Sharuhen was not a simple encampment. It was a fortified settlement with thick walls, deep wells, and wide storehouses capable of withstanding a long siege. The Hyksos who gathered within its defenses were the hardcore of their people. Veterans of decades of warfare, masters of chariot tactics, proud warriors who refused to surrender even when all hope had fled. They would fight to the end, not for victory, but for the dignity of dying on their own terms. Ahmose recognized the significance of this last bastion. If Sharuhen fell, the Hyksos legacy would crumble with it. So he laid siege with a patience forged in the deserts of Thebes. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and months to years. Sharuhen held out for 3 long years, its defenders fueled by desperation and memory. But slowly, inevitably, Egypt's grip tightened. The wells dried, the granaries emptied. Horses died in their stalls. The once mighty chariot lords found themselves reduced to rationing scraps and whispering prayers to gods who no longer answered. When the final assault came, it was swift and merciless. Egyptian chariots surged forward, their wheels cutting deep scars into the hardened earth, while infantry stormed the walls with ladders and grappling hooks. The defenders fought with a ferocity that surprised even Othmos's veterans, hurling spears from parapets, dragging attackers off ladders, and unleashing the last of their arrows in a torrent of defiance. But exhaustion is a foe no warrior can defeat. One by one, the Hyksos lines cracked. Pharaoh's elite troops flooded through breaches in the walls, meeting the remnants of the chariot warriors in brutal hand-to-hand combat where neither wheels nor horses could save them. When the dust settled, Sharuhen was silent. The Hyksos chieftains lay among the ruins, their dreams shattered, their lineage extinguished. With this final act, Egypt's long nightmare was over. But victory did not bring peace to Ahmos's mind. Instead, it revealed a truth he could no longer ignore. Egypt had been nearly destroyed by its own certainty. The belief that deserts would shield the kingdom, that tradition was enough to guarantee dominance, that walking armies could repel all threats, these illusions had allowed the Hyksos to rise. As Ahmos rode his chariot back toward the Nile, he studied the horizon and imagined an Egypt transformed. The weapon that had once humiliated the two lands would now become the symbol of its rebirth. Chariot workshops sprang up along the river. New training fields echoed with the thunder of hooves. Nobles learned the art of mounted archery, and generals began to rethink warfare entirely. Egypt would no longer wait behind its natural barriers for enemies to arrive. It would meet them beyond the sands, on open ground, with speed and precision. In the decades that followed, the ripple effects of the Hyksos invasion reshaped the world. Egypt expanded its influence into Canaan, Syria, and Nubia, forging an empire unlike anything the Nile had seen. The chariot became the throne on wheels, the instrument of pharaohs such as Thutmose III and Ramses II, who carved their victories into stone with scenes of dramatic charges, arrows flying, enemies scattering before them. The lesson of the Hyksos rang clear. Innovation, not tradition, determined the survival of nations. And yet, even as Egypt rose into its golden age, the memory of the Hyksos endured. Scribes chronicled the invasion as a dark age, a time of humiliation that tested the kingdom's spirit. Priests spoke of it as a warning from the gods, a punishment for complacency, and storytellers, in marketplaces and taverns, told tales of the day when foreigners on swift chariots stormed through the Delta like a desert storm, reminding every listener that even the mightiest civilization could be brought to its knees by a weapon it did not understand. For the people of Egypt, the Hyksos invasion became more than history. It became a symbol, a scar, and ultimately, a rebirth. The chariots that once broke their armies now carried their kings to glory. The warriors who once terrified them had taught them the art of speed, and the defeat that nearly destroyed their world had forged a new one capable of stretching its power across continents. In the end, the clash between chariots and walking armies became more than a military revolution. It became the crucible in which Egypt discovered its greatest strengths, its deepest weaknesses, and its unyielding will to rise again. As Ahmos's banners rose above the shattered gates of avarice and the last echoes of Hyksos resistance faded into the marshlands, Egypt stood at the edge of a transformation far larger than the victory itself. For though the foreign rulers had been expelled and their chariot lords driven toward distant horizons, their shadow still stretched across the consciousness of the two lands. Every scribe, every soldier, every farmer who had lived through the occupation carried memories that would shape the Egypt to come. Yet beneath the triumph, there lingered an unsettling truth. The Hyksos had not conquered Egypt through numbers or brute strength, but through ideas. Their invasion had revealed a weakness far more dangerous than any army, the belief that Egypt was untouchable. And so, in the months after the fall of Avaris, as Ahmose reorganized the kingdom and dispatched patrols to hunt the last pockets of resistance, tales spread across villages and military camps describing the invasion in tones both fearful and awe-stricken. People whispered of how the Hyksos seemed to glide across the desert, how their wheels barely touched the earth, how their arrows bent in mid-air as if guided by invisible hands. Even in defeat, they remained larger than life, their legends growing with every retelling. Ahmose understood that if Egypt were to remain strong, it needed more than victory. It needed rebirth. The South had endured hardship for decades, its people burdened by war, taxes, and exhausting campaigns. Its nobles strained by the constant pressure of arming and expanding military forces. But now, with the Delta reclaimed, the Nile once again flowed through a unified kingdom. And yet the wounds of occupation lay everywhere. Towns abandoned, trade routes broken, fields overgrown. The Hyksos had brought new weapons and new tactics, but they had also disrupted the delicate balance of Egypt's internal world. To restore order, Ahmose traveled north, visiting towns scarred by years of conflict. In every place he arrived, crowds gathered to see the young king whose determination had driven out the invaders. To the farmers of the Delta, he represented stability after chaos. To soldiers, he was a leader forged in war. To priests, he was the restorer of Ma'at, the divine balance the Hyksos had unraveled. But the Hyksos influence could not simply be erased, for many Egyptians had lived under their rule for an entire generation. Some had fought beside them. Others had adapted to their customs. Chariots now rolled on roads once meant only for foot traffic. Hyksos smiths had taught local craftsmen to forge stronger metal components. Their merchants had introduced new patterns of trade with lands Egypt had once viewed as distant and barbaric. Even after their defeat, the Hyksos had left behind knowledge that no wise ruler could ignore. Ahmose embraced this reality. He ordered workshops to expand chariot production, commissioned bowmakers to refine the composite bow, and invited craftsmen who had served the Hyksos to teach their techniques to Egyptian apprentices. The old military order was gone. A new one was taking shape, one that combined Egyptian discipline with Hyksos innovation. At the same time, Ahmose knew that Egypt must secure its borders so no foreign power could ever again exploit its complacency. He led campaigns into the Sinai, capturing fortresses the Hyksos had once used to funnel reinforcements into the Delta. He marched north into Canaan, crushing breakaway groups of Hyksos loyalists and bringing distant towns into Egypt's sphere of influence. Every victory sent a clear message. Egypt was not merely restored, it was ascending. But war and expansion brought their own unrest. Soldiers grew weary of constant campaigning. Families who had lost sons in the Liberation War now feared losing more in distant lands. And throughout the kingdom, people questioned whether the Hyksos threat was truly gone. Rumors spread that Hyksos chieftains were uniting in the north, preparing to reclaim what they had lost. Others said that new tribes had learned the secrets of chariot warfare and might someday descend upon Egypt just as the Hyksos had. Such fears reached the temples, where priests debated omens and signs, searching the stars for any hint of a future invasion. To calm the kingdom, Ahmose commissioned grand monuments celebrating the expulsion of the Hyksos. Reliefs depicted Pharaoh as a divine warrior striking down chariot-riding enemies. Priests recited hymns proclaiming that Egypt's gods had returned to full strength. In these carvings and rituals, the invasion became a moral tale. Chaos had risen, but order prevailed. And yet beneath the polished stone and confident proclamations lingered a quiet tension, for Egypt now lived in a world that felt larger and more dangerous than before. Meanwhile, in the northern deserts beyond the reaches of Egyptian authority, surviving Hyksos groups struggled to rebuild. They gathered in scattered encampments, their once great confederation fractured but not extinguished. Around their fires, they spoke bitterly of the past, recounting the days when their chariot wheels thundered across Egypt's fields. Their leaders argued endlessly about whether to regroup, retreat farther into Asia, or seek alliances with tribes to the east. Some believed Egypt would eventually become complacent again, that the luxury of victory would soften its warriors. Others insisted that Ahmose's new army, forged in war and hardened by conquest, was too powerful to challenge. In time, most Hyksos survivors drifted back into the nomadic currents of the Near East, their influence scattering like dust in the desert wind. But echoes of their presence remained. Egyptian generals studied their tactics for generations. Chariot corps became the pride of pharaohs from Thutmose to Ramesses. Every child born in the New Kingdom grew up hearing stories of the time foreigners seized Egypt's throne, reminders that even the mightiest civilization could be brought low if it failed to adapt. And still, the memory of those early defeats lingered in the minds of soldiers who had witnessed the horror of facing chariots on foot, of seeing comrades cut down by arrows shot from speeding platforms. Many veterans could close their eyes and hear the thunder of hooves, feel the tremble of earth beneath wheels, smell the dust of the Delta trenches where so many had fallen. The scars of those battles would never fully heal. As the decades passed, Egypt transformed from a kingdom recovering from occupation into a conquering empire. Ahmose's successors pushed deeper into foreign lands, determined to build buffer zones that would prevent any future invasion. New fortresses rose along the northeastern frontier, each one armed with chariots and archers trained in the hybrid style born from the Hyksos Wars. Egyptian scribes drafted detailed military manuals, recording what had once been oral traditions. Their writings spoke of chariot maneuvers, desert tactics, and the importance of speed and flexibility concepts unimaginable before the Hyksos arrival. And so Egypt's identity evolved. The invasion, terrifying though it had been, had forced the kingdom to shed its old certainties and embrace a new world. It had broken the illusion of eternal safety and replaced it with vigilance. It had shown that even in the most ancient and powerful civilization, stagnation could be fatal. Most of all, it had revealed the true nature of resilience, not in resisting change, but in mastering it. Yet the human stories behind the war stories of loss, betrayal, courage, and redemption remained woven into the fabric of everyday life. Families in the Delta remembered the day foreign chariots rolled through their villages. Children in Thebes were raised on tales of Seqenen-Retau's martyrdom, Kamos's defiance, and Ahmose's relentless pursuit of freedom. Soldiers sharing food around campfires recounted the battles their fathers had fought, describing the Hyksos not only as enemies but as teachers. And in this mixture of fear, respect, and hard-won wisdom, Egypt discovered a new kind of strength. The Hyksos had entered Egypt as conquerors, but they left as catalysts, forces of disruption that pushed Egypt into its greatest age of expansion and innovation. Their invasion, once a source of shame, became a turning point that scholars and warriors alike studied for centuries. For in the end, the story of the Hyksos was not merely a tale of chariots overwhelming walking armies. It was the story of a world forced awake, a kingdom transformed by adversity, and a civilization that learned to rise stronger than before. Even after the fall of Avaris, Egypt trembled with the memory of the Hyksos, for the scars they left were not merely physical, but woven into the very identity of the two lands. Stories spread across villages and temples, describing how the invaders had ridden like thunder, how their arrows had darkened the skies, and how their wheels had carved terror into the hearts of men who once believed themselves invincible. Parents whispered to children that the Hyksos had been monsters. But the elders, those who survived the earliest invasions, knew that the true horror came not from the nature of the Hyksos, but from the speed at which power could shift when a civilization grew complacent. As Egypt began to rebuild, Ahmose traveled the Nile from the Delta to Nubia, inspecting fortresses, reorganizing garrisons, and commissioning new chariot workshops. Everywhere he went, crowds gathered to see the king who had driven out the foreigners. The people looked upon him not just as a ruler, but as a symbol that Egypt's gods had awakened again. Yet even in triumph, Othmos knew how close Egypt had come to collapse. He spent long nights with his generals, studying Hyksos tactics, replicating their chariot maneuvers, and refining the strategies that had allowed him to prevail. What made the Hyksos so formidable had not been their numbers, for their armies were smaller than Egypt's. It had been their understanding that war could be fast, unpredictable, and shaped by innovation. Othmos vowed that Egypt would never again be caught unprepared. Craftsmen in Thebes were tasked with analyzing every component of the captured chariots. They measured the curve of the wheel spokes, the tension of the bowstrings, the flex of composite limbs made from wood, horn, and sinew. They studied the harnesses used to control pairs of well-trained horses, realizing that the Hyksos had turned the animals into extensions of their warriors' bodies. Egyptian stables soon filled with foals bred for endurance and strength, and specialized trainers drilled them not merely to run, but to respond to subtle commands, to pivot sharply, and to charge unflinchingly into battle. New chariot teams were assembled, drivers and archers bonded through relentless practice, learning to fight in tandem with a precision that rivaled the Hyksos elite. This transformation sparked something new within Egypt. Warriors who once marched in long, slow columns now felt the wind on their faces as their chariots soared across desert plains. They discovered the intoxicating blend of speed and power, and they understood why the Hyksos had been so confident in their supremacy. But this time, the chariots served Egypt. As the military evolved, so too did Egypt's political ambitions. Freed from the humiliation of foreign rule, Ahmose and his successors envisioned a nation that would no longer wait for threats to arrive at its borders. They would project power outward, turning vulnerability into empire. Campaigns were launched into Canaan, Syria, and Nubia, not for conquest alone, but to create buffer regions, control trade routes, and ensure that no future coalition like the Hyksos could rise unchecked. Egyptian chariot squadrons became the spearhead of these campaigns. Their golden wheels flashed beneath banners of brilliant blue, their arrows whistling through air as they swept across enemy lines with unstoppable momentum. Foreign rulers who once viewed Egypt as distant and passive now recognized it as a force capable of swift, decisive warfare. Diplomatic messengers traveled to Thebes bearing tribute, eager to appease the chariot kings of the south. Yet even as Egypt expanded, the memory of the Hyksos invasion endured, shaping every strategic decision. Generals reminded their troops that power must be earned and re-earned, for complacency was the true enemy. Scribes recorded tales of the invasion not to glorify the Hyksos, but to warn future generations that even mighty kingdoms could fall in the blink of an eye. Among these tales, one story became particularly famous, a story of an aging soldier named Nebamon, who had survived the first disastrous clash with Hyksos chariots at the frontier. Nebamon spoke not with bitterness, but with a somber clarity that captivated his listeners. He described how the earth had trembled beneath the hooves, how the chariots had seemed to fly rather than roll, and how the foreign archers had loosed arrows with such cold precision that it felt as if death itself had learned to run. But he always ended his tale with the same words. They came because we forgot to look beyond our own borders. They conquered because we refused to change. They fell because we learned what they knew. His voice became part of Egypt's collective memory, passed down from soldier to soldier, father to son. Meanwhile, in the northern deserts, where the Hyksos remnants had fled, stories of their defeat lingered like ghosts. Some chieftains swore they would someday return, reclaim Avaris, and restore their rule. But as years passed, their coalitions fractured, their supplies dwindled, and their unity dissolved. They had lost the one advantage that had once made them nearly unstoppable, the ability to strike faster and harder than their enemies. Now that Egypt possessed the same weapon, the balance had shifted permanently. Nevertheless, the world had changed. Nations beyond Egypt had witnessed the power of chariots and began adopting them. Syrian princes commissioned their own chariot workshops. Mitanni lords bred massive horses suited for heavy warfare. Hittite kings forged iron fittings to reinforce their chariot frames. The age of chariot empires had begun, and Egypt, once the victim of sudden innovation, now stood at the forefront of this new era. Pharaohs like Thutmose I, Thutmose III, and Amenhotep II, the successors of Ahmose, expanded Egypt's influence through chariot-based warfare, securing territories that stretched from the Fourth Cataract of the Nile to the Euphrates River. These later campaigns, though separated by decades from the Hyksos Invasion, were shaped entirely by the lessons learned from that dark chapter. Egyptian history became a testament to the idea that civilization survives not through isolation but through adaptation. And so, in quiet chambers lit by the soft glow of oil lamps, scribes penned accounts of the Hyksos Invasion, ensuring the tale would endure for thousands of years. They described how an army of walking soldiers faced a force that moved like lightning, how Egypt nearly collapsed under the weight of its own assumptions, and how it rose again stronger than before. They wrote of kings who refused to surrender, of warriors who learned to fight in ways their ancestors never imagined, and of a nation forged anew in the fires of crisis. The tale became more than history. It became a warning, a prophecy, and a reminder that innovation born outside one's borders can decide the fate of empires. Even now, long after the last Hyksos chariot crumbled into dust, the echo of their horses' hooves lingers in the corridors of memory, urging future generations to remain vigilant, to question certainty, and to remember that in the grand sweep of history, it is not always the larger army that wins, but the faster, the smarter, the more adaptable. Egypt learned this truth the hard way, and in doing so, it reshaped the destiny of the ancient world.